3 boxes on a bench, 22 long rifle, 22 Magnum, 17 HMR. 3 cartridges that have been arguing with each other in American gun shops for 24 years straight. And if you line up their velocity numbers the way almost every comparison lines them up, that argument is over in about 8 seconds. 40 grains of 22 long rifle, leaving the muzzle around 1,235 feet per second. 30 grains of 22 Magnum at 2,200. 17 grains of 17 HMR at 2,625. Charts done. Winner's obvious. Everybody go home. Except that might be the least useful answer in this entire video. Because on a ballistic chart, one of these cartridges appears to win before the comparison even starts. That is exactly why the chart is misleading. I'm Hank Mercer, and this is GunRank. Here's what that chart doesn't tell you. Those 3 numbers did not come from 3 rifles. They came from a laboratory. And the specification that produced them carries a footnote about one of these 3 cartridges. A footnote that changes how you should read every velocity figure printed on every box of it. We'll get there. But first, we have to throw out the question. Not which rimfire is the most powerful. The real question is, what problem am I actually paying this cartridge to solve? Because these 3 are not 3 rungs on the same ladder. They are 3 different answers, written in 3 different decades, to 3 genuinely different problems. Start in 1887. The J. Stevens Arms and Tool Company takes the existing 22 long case, puts a 40-grain bullet on top of it, and calls the result the 22 long rifle. Nobody in that room was trying to win a ballistics contest. They were trying to build something a working family could afford to shoot on a Sunday afternoon. Cheap, quiet, and everywhere. And hold on to one detail from that year, because we come back to it at the very end. The bullet they used was a heeled bullet, the same diameter on the outside as the case itself. That shape was inherited from converted cap-and-ball revolvers, and it is still on the shelf today. The 22 long rifle's superpower was never velocity, it's repetition. It is the only centerfire or rimfire cartridge in America where you can pull the trigger 2,000 times in a year without turning every range trip into a financial decision. Now jump to 1959. Winchester goes looking for something a 22 long rifle can't do. And instead of hot rodding it, they resurrect a corpse. They take the 22 Winchester rimfire, an 1890s round Winchester had let quietly die, and lengthen the case. Thicker walls, higher pressure, jacketed bullets. That becomes the 22 Winchester Magnum rimfire. The Marlin Levermatic got there first, in '59, because its design was easy to modify. Winchester's own Model 61 pump followed in 1960. By then, Smith & Wesson and Ruger already had revolvers waiting for it. The Magnum was never created to make plinking better. It was created to make rimfire do more. Then, 2002, David Emery, Hornady's senior ballistic scientist at the time, partners with Marlin, with Ruger, and with CCI. They take that Magnum case and neck it down to a 17 caliber bullet. And their question was different again. Not how do we hit harder, how do we make a rimfire easier, to aim at something small, farther away. Speed, flat trajectory, accuracy. That was the whole premise of the 17 HMR. So, affordability, capability, trajectory. 3 problems, 3 answers. Nobody was ever competing. Now, about those 3 numbers from the top of the video. They all come from the same document, SAMI's Rimfire Performance Standard, the 2026 update, approved this past April. And buried back in the equipment section is a single sentence most shooters have never read. All standard rimfire rifle test barrels shall be 24 inches long, and all exterior ballistic data for all rimfire rifle cartridges is based on that length. 24 inches. Not 18. Not 16 and a half. Not the handy little carbine in your truck. And that same standard says, in plain print, that because sporting firearms are built to looser tolerances than test barrels, there should be no expectation those velocities can be duplicated from any test, using actual firearms. Even in the lab barrel, the working tolerance is plus or minus 90 feet per second. So the chart everybody's arguing over on the internet? It's a comparison of 3 rifles almost nobody owns. That doesn't make the numbers useless. It makes them a starting line instead of a verdict. And it means the differences you actually experience are smaller and messier than the differences you read. Which brings us to the number nobody puts on the chart at all. Not cost per box. Cost per trigger pull, and more importantly, what that cost does to your behavior. Picture 2 shooters. One fires maybe 100 rounds a year, mostly pest control on the back 40. The other fires 2,500, mostly plinking and informal practice with his kid. Same rifle budget, same eyesight, completely different problem. Because if the second man buys the cartridge that wins on paper, and every trigger pull now costs him meaningfully more, something quiet happens. He shoots less. He tests fewer loads. He gets less familiar with his own rifle. Velocity is capability. But capability you never use is just expense. And here's the honest version of that. Because it cuts both ways. The cheapest cartridge is not automatically the best value. But the cartridge that lets you pull the trigger 5 times as often may quietly make you the better shooter. That's not theory. When John Haviland wrote his 20-year retrospective on the 17 HMR for American riflemen, he admitted he'd been a skeptic back in 2002. And his objection wasn't ballistics, it was cost. What changed his mind wasn't a chart, it was watching empty 17 HMR brass start covering the ground at his local range like gravel. People were voting with their wallets, and they were voting for a cartridge he'd written off. We'll come back to how that story ends, because it doesn't end where you'd think. Now let's take apart the second misconception, the one about range. The internet turns practical range into 3 variables: velocity, drop, energy. That's it. Real practical range depends on target size, wind, your shooting position, your optic, the specific load, the specific rifle, and how much accuracy the job actually demands. Change any one of those, and the answer moves. And this is where most viewers expect the 17 to bury the Magnum. So let's test that against somebody who actually did the work. Haviland ran both, in the field, over multiple seasons. His finding: comparing 17 HMR against 30-grain 22 Magnum loads, there wasn't a penny's worth of difference in bullet performance or trajectory out to 100 yards. So at 100 yards, the supposedly obvious winner suddenly becomes a lot less obvious. Past that line, the picture changes fast. Haviland found the Magnum falling off hard, with close to twice as much bullet drop at 150 and 200 yards as the 17. So the advantage is real, it's just not where most people think they're buying it. If 90% of your shots happen inside 100 yards, you are paying for a capability that mostly lives past the edge of your actual shooting. And there's a second half to that trade, which almost nobody talks about. Everybody sees 2,600 feet per second and thinks fast equals easy. But a 17-grain bullet is a 17-grain bullet. Flat trajectory solves the vertical problem. It does not repeal the weather. Dave Campbell, writing for American Rifleman, described shooting the 17 HMR for the very first time at a SHOT Show range day in 2002, in a bitterly cold gale. His verdict that afternoon was blunt. In that wind, it was nothing more than a noisemaker. First impression of the flattest shooting rimfire in America, and the wind simply took the bullets and threw them somewhere else. And that isn't ancient history. Haviland's own field numbers, decades later, tell the same story. Stretching a 17 HMR to 200 yards took him about 7.5 inches of holdover and nearly a foot of horizontal hold to deal with the wind. Read those 2 numbers again. The wind correction was bigger than the drop correction. Flat shooting and forgiving shooting are not the same thing. That is not an argument against the 17 HMR. It's an argument for knowing precisely which problem it solves. It solves elevation beautifully. It never promised to solve Wyoming. Now here's where this whole comparison starts to fall apart, on its own terms. Because we keep saying the 22 long rifle and the 22 Magnum like each one is a single object. Open SAMI's own velocity table, and that idea dies immediately. For the 22 long rifle, at 40 grains, that standard lists 4 different nominal velocities. Same caliber, same bullet weight, 4 separate numbers, from around 1,040 feet per second, all the way up past 1,200. The Magnum is listed from 28 grains up to 50 grains, running from roughly 1,550 to 2,200 feet per second. The 17 HMR spans 15.5 grains to 20. And that's just the standard. When American riflemen sat down with CCI this year for the company's 75th anniversary, they tried to count the 22 long rifle offerings on the market and lost track somewhere in the 30s. So when somebody tells you what the 22 Magnum does, ask them which one. And now that footnote. SAMI sets the maximum average pressure for the 22 long rifle at 24,000 pounds per square inch. For the 22 Magnum, same number. 24,000. But pressure limits aren't just a ceiling. The standard also assumes a consistency figure, a coefficient of variation of 4%, held across the entire rimfire spectrum. Across the entire spectrum, except for one cartridge. There's a footnote. It reads, in effect, that experience has shown the 22 Winchester Magnum rimfire displays variation higher than other rimfire cartridges, so a coefficient of 10% has been established for it instead. 10% instead of 4, 2.5 times the allowable spread. And the arithmetic follows it right down the page. At that identical 24,000-pound limit, the Magnum's maximum probable sample mean comes out at 27,800, where the 22 long rifle sits at 25,500. That is not a rumor off a forum. That is the American firearms industry, in its own consensus standard, quietly writing down that the Magnum is the least consistent of the three. And it lines up with something else. At introduction, the Magnum's 40-grain load was advertised up in the 2,000 feet per second neighborhood. Rifle Magazine has reported that the listed figure was later cut to 1,910. SAMI's current number for that same 40-grain load, 1,875. The number moved, twice. The cartridge never did, which is worth sitting with for a second. Because a whole generation of Americans bought that rifle believing a figure the industry itself walked back, and most of them never heard about it. Here at GunRank, we'd rather hand you the footnote than the headline. But there's another problem almost nobody includes in these comparisons. You don't actually buy a cartridge, you buy a rifle. And the rifle drags an entire ecosystem behind it. Look at Ruger's rotary magazines. In the 77 series, 22 long rifle feeds 10 plus 1. Step up to 22 Magnum or 17 HMR, and you're at 9 plus 1. Different magazine, different part number, different price, and Ruger sells a separate 15-round Magnum family magazine because the standard 22 long rifle magazines simply don't apply. CZ tells the same story from the other direction. The 457 is one receiver that will host 22 long rifle, 22 Magnum, or 17 HMR, with barrels that swap on a single nut. Beautiful piece of engineering for exactly this comparison. But even there, the magazines split by family, and Haviland flagged something telling. The older 455 mini set, shipped with all 3 barrels. The current 457 American combo doesn't include a 22 Magnum barrel at all. That's not a spec sheet. That's a company reading its own sales data and telling you where the middle of the market went. You don't own a cartridge. You own a rifle that happens to fire one. And every part you'll ever buy for it comes from the cartridge's world, not yours. Which brings us to Lewiston, Idaho, and the part of this story that should end the argument entirely. Whatever brand name is printed on the box of 17 HMR in your hand, the odds are overwhelming it was manufactured by CCI in Lewiston, and it started life as a 22 Magnum case. Justin Rugseger, CCI's engineering director, explained the wrinkle to American riflemen. Because the 17's neck is so narrow, they can't prime it afterward. The priming compound goes into the case first, and then the machine necks it down. One stroke of a die on a case that is already primed. And the early years were not smooth. Some case necks split. That left too little tension on the bullet, and the relatively slow propellant wouldn't light. The primer still fired, and that alone was enough to push a bullet partway into the barrel and leave it there. Chamber the next round on top of that, and you have a wrecked rifle and a hurt shooter. The fix was to stress relieve those necks by annealing them, except the usual way to anneal is with heat, and there was live priming compound inside the case. Ruegseger's line was that it took them quite a while to work out. They don't use heat, and the rest is a trade secret. Now hold all of that next to the argument in the gun shop. At that plant, one line runs 17 HMR and another runs 22 Magnum, side by side. Ruegseger's estimate was that they make more 17s than Magnums, but not by much, because there are simply a lot of Magnum rifles out there. 2 cartridges, adjacent production lines, one built out of the other one's brass. They were never fighting each other. We were. So let's turn all of this into something you can actually use. This is the GunRank Rimfire Use-Case Matrix. High-volume plinking and practice. The priority is cost and repetition, and the answer is usually 22 long rifle. Volume is a capability. New or occasional shooter, or a first rifle for a young one. 22 long rifle again, and not because it's a beginner's round. Because the ecosystem is enormous and forgiving. Traditional small game work, long rifle or Magnum, depending entirely on your quarry, your realistic distance, and what your state's regulations actually permit. Check those before you check a chart. You need more rimfire capability without stepping up to centerfire. That's the Magnum's founding mission, and it still holds it. Small targets at longer practical distances. 17 HMR. That is the exact problem it was invented to solve. Precision-minded field use, on a day when conditions cooperate. 17 HMR, and it's very strong there. One rifle, mostly casual shooting. 22 long rifle, you'll shoot it more. One rifle, mostly field utility. 22 Magnum, honest middle ground. Dedicated varmint-oriented rimfire. 17 HMR, and it earns it. Notice the word doing the work in all of that. Is usually, not always. Then run 5 questions before you spend $1. How many rounds will I realistically fire per year? Where do 80% of my actual shots happen? Is recreational shooting or field work the bigger share? Which rifle do I genuinely want to own and carry? And can I reliably get the specific load I need where I live? Answer those 5 honestly, and the cartridge picks itself. That whole matrix, an annual ammunition cost worksheet, the cost per 100 and cost per 1,000 math, and the 5-question selector are all in a free guide. Links in the description. Take it to the counter with you. One last thing. Remember that healed bullet from 1887. In 2024, Winchester introduced a new rimfire called the 21 Sharp. Same 22 long rifle case. Same overall length. Same 24,000-pound pressure limit. The only significant thing they changed was the bullet diameter, down to 2/10 105, specifically so the bullet no longer has to be healed, which frees it to be jacketed, or copper, or plated, or anything else. Think about what that means. Handed a cartridge with 137 years of history, the industry looked hard at it and decided the limitation worth fixing wasn't speed, or energy, or reach. It was a bullet shape, the 22 long rifle inherited from converted cap-and-ball revolvers, and never managed to put down. So there's no winner here. There never was. 22 long rifle optimizes repetition. 22 Magnum optimizes capability and versatility. 17 HMR optimizes trajectory and reach. The mistake was believing these 3 were competing for the same job. The best rimfire isn't the one that can do the most. It's the one whose advantages you'll actually use, and whose compromises you won't spend every weekend fighting. I've watched too many good people buy the winner of a chart and end up with a rifle they take out twice a year, feeling vaguely guilty every time they walk past the safe. Don't buy the chart. Buy the year you're actually going to have. This has been GunRank. Go shoot something cheap and hit it.